By the summer of 1870, the old cotton warehouse by the river no longer held bales. It held beds. They called it a hospital. Freedmen's Hospital for Colored. But the floor was still the same rough planks that had known spilled seed and sweat. The windows were patched with oiled paper. Carbolic stung the nose, fighting with the sour damp of the Mississippi. On a heat-heavy afternoon, 2 men carried Rachel Mayfield in on a door torn from its hinges. She was not young anymore, though no one knew her exact years. Her hair was threaded with gray, her eyes sunk deep. The cloth over her belly was dark with fresh blood. "Set her here," Dr. Charles Whitman said, rolling up his sleeves. He was a former army surgeon, thin from too many campaigns, pale in this Delta sun. "Easy now. Easy." They laid her on a narrow iron bed that rattled under the weight. Her abdomen, even through the sheet, rose like a hill, stretched smooth and unnatural, a shape these people had been watching for 2 decades. "That the one from Cypress Bend," someone near the door whispered. "She'd been carrying since before the war." Aunt Dinah pushed through the onlookers, scarf tight over her head, a leather bag hitting her thigh. She had caught more babies in slave quarters than Whitman had delivered on battlefields. Her hands were calloused, nails clean. "Rachel," she said, laying a hand on the woman's damp forehead. "You hear me?" Rachel's eyes fluttered. "It won't come," she rasped. "It never come." Behind them, a young colored nurse, Lydia, lit an extra lamp. The yellow circle of light fell not just on Rachel's face and swollen middle, but on the ring of dark faces at the edge of the room. Women with arms folded, men with hats twisting between their fingers. Whitman listened to the pulse at her throat, then pressed along her abdomen. The mass was hard, unmoving, like stone. "How long has she been like this?" he asked Dinah. "Since Master's boy put hands on her," Dinah answered without softening the words. "War wasn't even started. Belly growed, then stopped moving. Stayed big. I told him something dead in there. They didn't pay coin for surgeons on black wombs." Whitman's jaw tightened. He had seen strange things in the field. Bullets grown over with bone, men walking for years with iron lodged in them. But this, it may be an old calcified fetus, or a tumor. Either way, if we do nothing, she'll bleed out today. Rachel turned her face toward the wall. "You gon' sell it too," she whispered, like they said back then. "No one is selling anything," Whitman said, though he wasn't sure what would be done with whatever he found. "We're trying to keep you alive." Dinah leaned close to Rachel's ear. "You held it all this time so white folks couldn't take it," she murmured. "But if it stays now, it'd take you. You hear? Sometimes you gotta let sorrow out." The women at the doorway hushed. They knew those words, even if they had never heard them quite like that. Whitman sent most of the crowd outside. Only Lydia and Dinah stayed, aprons on, basins ready. He poured liquor between Rachel's lips, enough to dull but not to drown. There was no ether to spare that day. The next hour was a blur of low cries, commands, sweat, and steel. Whitman worked with practiced efficiency, Dinah's palms steady at Rachel's sides, Lydia wiping blood away before it could pool. When at last Whitman lifted the thing that had lived inside her for 20 years, the room fell silent. It was not flesh in any way they knew. It was dense, chalky, the size of a newborn drawn in on itself. Bone shapes lay imprisoned in the white shell, a rounded dome like a small skull, a curved ridge that might have once been ribs. Salt deposits had smoothed edges and filled gaps, turning what had begun life as a child into something between relic and rock. Lydia's hand flew to her mouth. Dinah did not look away. "That," Whitman said carefully, "is a long-standing calcified fetus, lithopedion." He spoke as much to the future article forming in his mind as to the women in the room. I have read of such, but never seen one. Dinah's voice was low, meant for Rachel more than for him. 2 whole tens of years you carried what they threatened to steal. Now it come out hard as stone. No breath left in it. Outside the door, the news was already moving. Rachel had birthed a rock baby. A white man's sin turned to stone. A sign that the Lord was tired of granting children to people who had theirs sold. Whitman rinsed the mass in a basin, his fingers respectful despite himself. He could see the presentation in Little Rock, perhaps even a note sent to Washington. "This should be preserved," he said, "for study, for the medical society." He took a wide-mouthed glass jar from a shelf, poured in clear spirit, and lowered the stone bundle into its bath. The liquid lapped over chalk and bone. Tiny bubbles rose and clung. Lydia labeled the jar in a careful hand. Colored female, approx 40, Arkansas. Calcified fetus, 20 years duration. Dinah watched him set the glass on the table, where the afternoon light from the high window struck it and threw a warped shadow across the floorboards. "They kept our babies on chains before," she said, the words shaped more like a curse than a comment. "Now they'll keep 'em in glass." Whitman hesitated, his hand still on the jar's rim, as if for a moment he, too, could see more than specimen and spirit in that swirling alcohol. Long before that glass jar ever touched Dr. Whitman's fingers, the thing inside it already had a history. On Cypress Bend Plantation, when Rachel was still more girl than woman, her world was the big house kitchen and the back stairs. She scrubbed pans till her wrists ached, carried platters through rooms where she was meant to be invisible, kept her eyes low when white voices sharpened. Thomas Rutledge, the master's son, was home from some schooling back east. He liked to lean in the kitchen doorway late at night, smelling of whiskey and pipe smoke, watching the women finish their work. He learned early that the back stairs had no witnesses. Rachel never spoke out loud about those nights. The other women didn't need her to. They saw her come to breakfast with her knuckles white around the coffee pot, shoulders drawn in as if she were trying to fold herself out of sight. They knew that look. Some of them had worn it. When her monthly bleeding missed once, then twice, Aunt Dinah pressed a hand low on her belly and met her eyes. "You carryin'," she said, voice flat with knowledge, not joy. "You know whose." Rachel stared past her, toward the fields. "If it live," she whispered, "they gon' take it." The mistress settled the matter in a single icy sentence, spoken as if she were discussing livestock. "If that dark brat comes to term," Mrs. Rutledge said, folding napkins, "it will be sold as soon as it's worth anything. I won't have his mistakes running about the place." The words lodged in Rachel's chest like a second heartbeat. Every time the child inside stirred, the echo of that promise stirred with it. She began to hold her belly at night, not like women do when they dream of tiny hands, but like someone bracing a door. As the months passed, her body rounded, heavy, the way other expectant women's did. In the quarters, they counted with her. In the big house, they pretended nothing was happening. Thomas looked through her as if she were a chair. Then came the day everything changed. It was harvest time. The air was thick with lint and dust. Rachel had been sent from the kitchen to the smokehouse for salt. On the way back, she crossed the yard just as an overseer, angry at some boy in the distance, swung his whip back too wide. The plaited leather caught her across the side and belly with a crack that emptied her lungs. She went down hard in the dirt, jar flying from her hand. Later, she remembered only heat and the taste of iron in her mouth. That night, the pain started. Blood soaked her dress. Dinah came running, shoving aside other hands, barking orders for rags, water, fire. They laid Rachel on a pallet in the corner of the quarters. Children pushed outside. Men kept at the door. Hours stretched. Rachel moaned and clawed at the straw. No baby came. Sometime near dawn, the cramps faded to a dull ache. The bleeding slowed. The little flutter she had felt for weeks was gone. "It stopped moving," Rachel whispered, staring at the rafters. Her face was slick with tears and sweat. "Dinah, it gone?" The old woman's eyes were tired. She had seen more midnights than she cared to count, more small, bodies wrapped in cloth. "Feels like it passed on," Dinah said softly. "But it ain't passed out. Not yet." In the days that followed, Rachel did not get smaller. The other women watched. They had seen bellies swell and flatten, seen mothers bury new graves and go back to the fields with empty arms. Rachel went back to the field, still burdened, her steps slow, back bent, a strange stillness in her middle. Weeks turned to months. Her stomach stayed, round and firm. But there was no kicking, no tightening, no milk rising in her breasts. Just weight. A constant heavy presence pressing on her spine, her bladder, her sleep. The plantation's white doctor came once at the master's request, more to reassure the family than to comfort the enslaved woman. He pried at her with cold fingers, pressed down until she gasped, listened with a tin horn for signs of life, heard none. In his leather notebook, under a date and a line about the mistress's headaches, he jotted, "Negro female, about 19. Persistent abdominal enlargement after presumed fetal demise. Hard mass, non-tender, possibly tumor. No intervention recommended at present." For him, it was a curiosity in a margin. For Rachel, it was the shape of every day that followed. In the quarters, the story grew around her like vines. "She don't want that baby took," one woman said over the washtubs, so she locked it up inside. "Old folks back in Carolina used to talk about women carrying dead babies till they turned to stone," an elder added quietly, eyes on her hands. "Said it happened when grief too strong to let go." Dinah didn't argue. She just watched Rachel move through the yard, hand pressed to her side, as if steadying something too precious or too terrible to name. At night, Rachel lay awake listening to the snores and coughs around her, one arm under her head, the other curved protectively over her unmoving burden. "Lord," she prayed into the dark, not sure which Lord would be listening. White folks' God from the preacher's mouth, or the older one she heard in the moans and songs. "Don't let 'em sell my baby. If it gotta die, don't let 'em put a price on it. Keep it hid, even if that mean it stay with me till I go." It was not a prayer any catechism had taught her. It was the logic of a woman who had watched children marched away in chains while their mothers screamed into their aprons. The seasons rolled on. Other pregnancies came and went around her. Babies were born, named, and sometimes gone before they could walk. Young boys were sold down river. Girls her age grew into women, then wore themselves out in the rows. Rachel's body changed only in the lines of her face, the weariness in her eyes. Her belly remained, hard and solid as the millstones by the gin. By the time cannon sounded along the Mississippi and talk of war seeped even into the slave quarters, people on Cypress Bend no longer asked when she was due. They had another way of saying it. "She been carrying longer than any of us been alive," a field hand told a newcomer. "She don't tote just a baby in there. She tote all the years they stole." When the war crept into Arkansas, Rachel's body had already become a kind of rumor. Soldiers came and went, patrols roamed the river roads, and yet nothing changed inside her. The weight she carried outlasted officers, overseers, even the master's temper. In 1863, a blue-coated column passed near Cypress Bend. The Rutledges panicked, hiding trunks and horses. For a brief moment, the quarters stirred with hope. Some slipped into the timber, with nothing but a tin cup and a blanket, following whispers of Union camps upriver. Rachel tried to go with them. She made it past the cotton rows before her breath seized. The load inside her tightened like a vice, and her legs buckled. 2 young men lifted her under the arms, tried to carry her, but the mud was deep, and her pain so sharp she bit through her lip. At last they set her beneath a fallen sycamore, apologizing between gasps. "Forgive us, Miss Rachel. You too heavy with that thing. We gotta run." They left her there with the cicadas screaming in the branches. When Union pickets found her, she was half-conscious, smeared with dirt, clutching her belly as if something might fall out. At the field hospital outside Helena, tents flapped in the river wind. Rachel lay on a cot between a fevered soldier and a boy whose foot had been taken by a mule and a surgeon's knife. Blood was everywhere, on canvas, on bandages, on the surgeon's apron. Even the flies seemed exhausted. A Union assistant surgeon, Lieutenant Marcus Ellery, knelt beside her. He had the air of a young man who had read too many textbooks and not seen enough of the world to mistrust them yet. He prodded her abdomen with clinical detachment. "How many months," he asked, "has this swelling persisted?" Rachel turned her head away. "Don't ask me," she murmured. "Ask the ones who owned me." He frowned at her tone, not the meaning. He tapped her belly again, hard, unyielding. "Extraordinary," he said under his breath. "If she survives the march, this should be documented." Dinah, who had followed on her own feet after learning Rachel was taken by the soldiers, stepped between him and the cot. "She ain't no museum," she said. "She's somebody's child." Ellery barely acknowledged her. "Possible lithopedion," he reported to his superior, scribbling fast. "Negro female, roughly mid-20s. No fetal activity. Mass seems ossified. Could be significant for Army Medical Museum." Rachel heard the words even through the pounding in her ears. Museum. Specimen. Mass. They talked over her as if she were a carcass on a table, not a woman whose nights had been carved out by fear. A chaplain stopped by later, opening his Bible to the book of Job. "Sister," he said gently, "there are burdens we are asked to bear." Rachel cut him off, voice ragged. "Mine ain't his askin', it's theirs." For a moment he closed the book, unsure what prayer fit this kind of truth. Within days, the Army moved on. They had no time for the wounded who could walk, or the civilians too frail to drag along. Rachel was loaded onto a cart and returned to the plantation's edge with a handful of others. Contraband, not fit for transport. Back at Cypress Bend, the war buzzed like a distant storm. White fear thickened, black hope bent under it. Patrols tightened, food thinned. But Rachel's life kept its same slow rhythm, rising, walking, working, sleeping with that cold heaviness pressing on her lungs. One night in 1865, after word spread that Lee had yielded, the quarters broke into cautious song. Freedom, they said, was coming downriver quicker than any overseer could stop it. Rachel sat outside, back against the cabin wall. Dinah lowered herself onto the step beside her. "You free now," Dinah said, not quite smiling. "Ain't nobody gon' own you again." Rachel touched her belly. It felt heavier in that moment than it had in months. "If I'm free," she whispered, "why this still chained to me?" Dinah didn't answer. She looked at the swollen mound, at the woman beside her, whose spine had begun to curve under 2 decades of carrying a memory that had turned to stone. Later that summer, federal agents came to reorganize labor, and Cypress Bend became a place of contracts instead of chains. Families tried to mend themselves. New churches began in brush arbors. Children who once hid from white men now traced their letters in dust. But every person in the quarters knew the one who had not changed with freedom. Rachel walked among them with her slow, steady steps, the shape inside her like a sealed room no sunlight reached. When the bureau doctor came to inspect the plantation, he asked after the woman he'd heard described as the long pregnant one. A few field hands brought Rachel to him. He tapped her belly as if sounding a barrel. It gave no hollow reply. "You should have sought intervention long ago," he muttered. Rachel looked straight at him, something fierce flickering beneath her fatigue. "The only intervention I ever seen was white hands taking children from their mothers," she said. "I kept mine, even if it died." The doctor shifted back, rattled by the quiet certainty in her tone. By 1870, when she staggered into the Freedmen's Hospital, that same conviction clung to her like a second skin. She had crossed slavery, war, sickness, rumor, and the kind of private grief no one else could hold. As the stretcher-bearers carried her into the building, someone whispered, "She'd been carrying death in her since I was a child." But Dinah, walking behind, murmured something else. "She'd been carrying a story none of 'em want written down." And just as the door swung shut, Rachel's breath hitched, a low, guttural sound, as if whatever she had trapped inside her for 20 years had heard those words and stirred for the first time in decades. By dawn, the old cotton house had the hush of a chapel before a funeral. The bales were long gone. In their place stood 2 rough tables, a cabinet of bottles, and a chipped basin where the night's blood had dried to a dark crust. The river mist still clung to Whitman's beard when he stepped in, sleeves rolled, face already set. Rachel lay there, skin waxy, hair slick to her temples. Her belly rose under the sheet like a hill whose soil had been packed too long. Dinah wiped her lips with a rag dipped in water and sassafras, murmuring words that were more breath than sound. Whitman felt along the curve of her abdomen again, thumbs pressing deep. He listened to the lack of any stir within. "It's not going to move for you," Rachel whispered, eyes half open. "It already had its chance." He didn't answer. "If we do nothing," he told Dinah and the young nurse Lydia, "she'll likely die of fever or rupture. If we intervene, she may still die. But there is some hope." Dinah's jaw tightened. "You cut on her, you answer to someone higher than your medical society." "Today I answer to hemorrhage," he replied. "Prepare the basin." They gave Rachel a mouthful of whiskey and something bitter from Whitman's pouch. It dulled just enough for him to begin. Lydia's hand shook as she held the lamp nearer, its flame trembling with her. Outside, women from the settlement huddled in the dirt, their skirts damp with river dew, straining to catch any sound through the thin walls. Inside, there were no long screams, only broken groans and a hoarse chant from Dinah. Time folded into the rhythm of Whitman's breathing, the clink of instruments, the thick, wet slide of what would not be borne in any ordinary way. At last he drew back, forearms spattered, something heavy in his gloved hands. It was not a child. It was a knot of hardened flesh and bone, gray-yellow under the lamplight, curled on itself. In places, Whitman could trace the arc of a tiny skull, the suggestion of ribs, the curve of what might once have been a limb, all welded together by chalky deposits. It looked less like a body and more like a memory that had turned to stone. A second mass followed, softer, ragged, the remnants of what should have nourished life and had instead clung on in darkness for decades. Dinah received it with both palms, eyes wet, lips moving. Whitman stared, unable for a moment to find the Latin he needed. Then, almost reverently, he laid the calcified shape in a metal tray. 20 years, Dinah breathed. They left it in there 20 harvests. Lydia crossed herself, in the way of her Catholic mother, though she'd learned to hide that habit in Protestant Arkansas. "Is she—" Rachel gave a small, shuddering sigh. "Feel light," she rasped, voice thin. Like somebody took a stone off my chest and set it on the table. Blood still seeped, but the worst danger seemed to pass. Whitman bound, stitched, wrapped, his hands automatic. He did not dwell on her words. Behind the door, someone must have peeked when Lydia stepped out for more cloth. By afternoon, whispers had outrun the flies. She pushed out a rock, one woman said. No, answered another, voice low. I saw it. It had a little head shape, but white like chalk. She carried a dead white baby till it turned to stone. By evening, half the Black Quarter had some version. A few crossed themselves and said it was a curse. Others shook their heads and said, no curse could cling that long to one woman unless it belonged to a whole people. Whitman washed up, changed his shirt, and sat at a crate-turned desk. He dipped pen in ink and began a careful account. Age, approximate. Parity, unknown. Duration of enlargement, near 20 years by her own report. He described the mass in precise terms, noted its hardness, its resemblance to known instances in European literature. The word he chose, lithopedion, pleased him. It sounded tidy, contained. At the bottom, he added a line. Specimen preserved in spirit for possible submission to Army Medical Museum. When he went back to the table, he found Dinah standing over the tray, arms folded. I'll need that, he said. She did not move. What you plan to do? Preserve it. Others can learn from it. Perhaps prevent another woman from suffering so long. You mean they can point at it in some room up north, she replied, and talk about what a strange thing came out of a black woman in Arkansas. Lydia hovered at the edge, caught between her training and her allegiance to the women outside. Whitman's tone cooled. I don't ask you to approve, Aunt Dinah. I ask you to hand me the tray. After a long pause, she slid it toward him. He lifted the weight with both hands and lowered it into a glass jar, pouring clear spirit until the chalky surface was submerged. The thing bobbed once, then settled. Limbs that were no longer limbs pressed against the curved glass. He scratched a label. Colored female, Arkansas, C. 20-year intra-abdominal lithopedion. The letters looked too straight for what had happened here. Night wrapped the cotton house in cricket noise. The hospital quieted. Lydia snored softly on a pallet in the corner. Whitman had gone to his quarters, his prized jar resting in a wooden crate beside his desk, ready for packing. Dinah waited until his footsteps faded. Then she slipped inside, candle cupped in her palm. The jar glowed on the table, its contents distorted by the glass and the sway of the flame. She set the candle down, laid her fingers on the cool curve. For a heartbeat, the room was nothing but her pulse and the soft tick of spirit against glass. They took you once, she whispered to what floated within, voice rough. Took you when you still had breath. She kept you anyway. They ain't about to take all of you a second time. Her other hand slid to the cork, testing how firmly it sat. The candle sputtered, sending shadows crawling up the warped walls, as if the old cotton house itself were leaning in to hear what she would do next. Dinah worked the cork loose with a slow twist, listening for any sound from Whitman's quarters. The plug came free with a soft sigh. Spirit fumes bit her nostrils. Inside, the pale mass drifted, surface gleaming. She slid 2 fingers through the opening, old knuckles whitening around the rim so she wouldn't drop it. The preserved lump nudged her skin, harder than bone, smoother than rock. Feeling along its edge, she found a tiny spur that might once have been part of a shoulder, no bigger than the tip of her thumb. That's enough, she breathed. She don't need all of you living on a shelf. With a careful pinch, she broke the fragment loose. The main piece rocked in the liquid, as if offended. Dinah slipped the shard into a rag she'd tucked in her sleeve and pressed the cork back, tamping it down with the heel of her hand. She topped the jar with fresh spirit from a bottle, wiped the glass, straightened the label. By morning, Whitman would see nothing amiss. Just before dawn, she walked behind the hospital, past the discarded packing crates and a row of blackened stumps. 3 women waited there, shawls pulled tight against the river chill. Lydia, eyes red from a sleepless night, clutched a small spade. "You sure we ought to?" she whispered. "You want them to be the only ones telling this story?" Dinah asked. "Give me that." They knelt by a scrubby sycamore, where the ground turned soft with years of wash water. Dinah dug a narrow hole, no bigger than a jar. From the folded cloth, she produced the bit of calcified matter. In the early light, it looked ordinary, like any bit of broken shell. The other women did not see it that way. "That's somebody's child," one murmured. "It's all of them," another said. "All the babies they took from us. All the ones we never got to hold." Dinah laid the fragment in the dirt. "Lord," she said, voice low but steady, "we bring you what never had a name and what they tried to turn into a specimen. We lay down the part they can't catalog. Let it rest with us, not with them." They covered it, handful by handful. No hymn, no marker, just 4 women and the sound of their breath. When they stood, Lydia made a small cross in the air, more out of habit than doctrine. Dinah simply placed her palm flat on the fresh earth. "Now," she said, "let them have their glass thing. This piece stays home." Inside, Whitman was already drafting his paper. He wrote in neat, upright script, pausing only to dip his pen. "Case of prolonged lithopedion in a colored woman, Arkansas, 1870. He set out the facts as he preferred them. Age estimated from dentition and skin, approximate duration of abdominal enlargement, measurements of the mass, consistency, comparison to cases reported in France and Germany. Slavery, rape, threats of sale. Those entered only as thin qualifiers. Patient gave history of intense fear concerning disposition of potential offspring, he noted, which may have contributed to delayed presentation. One sentence, tucked between Latin phrases, bearing more weight than he let on. In a marginal note he added, "Negro constitution appears notably tolerant of long-standing intra-abdominal pathology." He did not consider how that sentence would read to anyone whose body had carried such tolerance. When the article eventually appeared in a slim Arkansas journal, it would speak of tissues and durations, not of a young woman told her child would be prophet, not kin. Rachel lived. She rose slowly, ribs aching from the way they'd pressed against that mass for half a lifetime. The bulge beneath her gown receded. Her hands, exploring, found flatness where there had always been pressure. She walked bent for a while, more from habit than necessity, then straighter, as if learning her own dimensions anew. But there were mornings when she woke with her arms curved, as if around something that was no longer there. On those days, she slipped out behind the hospital, to the sycamore, where the earth had settled just enough to show it had been disturbed. She spoke to the spot without looking over her shoulder. "They got your shell in a jar," she murmured. "But the part that mattered stayed with me 20 years. You ain't theirs." Other women began to follow her there. Some brought scraps of cloth, little tokens they tucked into the soil, buttons from baby clothes, broken combs, bits of twine. No one called it a grave, but they walked away lighter, as if they'd dropped a weight they'd been carrying in silence. Whitman heard rumors of prayer by the back tree and disapproved, quietly. "Superstitious gatherings are unhelpful to convalescence," he wrote in a note to himself. Still, he did not forbid it. He had his own ambitions to tend. Weeks later, a crate left Helena on a steamer bound north. Packed among bandages and outdated instruments was a padded box holding a single jar. Inside, the hardened mass floated, label tied firm. Lithopedion, female, colored, Arkansas. By the time it reached Washington, the paper tag was damp at the edges. A clerk in a dim storeroom copied the information into a ledger, squinting in the thin light. Litho. What? He muttered. Just put stone fetus, his superior told him. Negro woman. Arkansas. He wrote as instructed, mishearing the name Whitman had scrawled. Rachel Maywood, colored. Mayfield slipped under his pen, one letter at a time. The jar slid onto a high shelf beside skulls, bones, and wax models. Its glass caught the lantern once, flashing a brief, dull gleam, then dullness returned. Around it, conversations in the museum moved on to other curiosities. Back in Arkansas, the sycamore behind the little hospital pushed new leaves. Under its roots lay a sliver of what Washington believed it owned, surrounded by red earth and the whispered stories of women who refused to let their dead turn only into a paragraph in a medical report. The woman in the straight-backed chair in 1937 said her name was Martha Lee, though on the interviewer's card it came out, M. Leah, colored, aged approx. 80. They sat on a porch in Phillips County. The young white man from the federal project wiped his forehead and asked if she remembered anything unusual from the old days. He expected whipping stories, perhaps a tale about Sherman. Instead, she leaned forward and tapped her own belly. We had a woman, Martha said, over by Helena long time ago. They say she'd been carrying a baby since she was a gal. War come and gone. Presidents changed. She's still walking with that big stomach. When it finally come out, weren't no cry. Just a hard little thing with white bone hid inside. We said she'd been keeping slavery in there till it turned to rock. He shifted in his chair, pencil hovering. Superstition, he prompted. Call it what you want, she replied. We seen enough to know when something ain't just doctor's words. In his typed transcript later, he moved the story under a small heading. Folklore. Woman who bore a stone child. Names were omitted. A note in the margin. Possibly metaphorical. Decades slid over those pages like dust. Near the end of the 20th century, in a quiet reading room in Little Rock, another man bent over microfilm. He was older than the WPA interviewer, black instead of white, with half-moon glasses and a notebook already crowded with dates and case numbers. He had started with an article cited in a bibliography. Case of prolonged lithopedion in a colored woman, Arkansas, 1870, by C. Whitman, M.D. The clinical tone was exactly what he expected. Measurement, Latin roots, the brief nod to primitive beliefs he'd seen in 100 19th century journals. Then he saw it. Patient, enslaved until 1865 on Cypress Bend Plantation near Helena. He wrote down the plantation name, turned to another roll of film. An old county death register supplied. R. Mayfield, colored, abdominal complications, 1870. In a catalog of the old Army medical collection, he found a line about a specimen from Arkansas. Lithopedion, female, Negro, later marked, misplaced, or removed during reorganization. He frowned, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and went looking for the WPA narratives. On the screen, Martha's porch conversation flickered into view. No name for the woman, but the county matched. The length of the pregnancy, the timing around freedom, the way the old woman described a hard little form and a pale core. He circled the page number, then pulled a church record on thin onion skin paper. In a Freed People's congregation near Helena, someone had once written, "Special prayer for sister who carried sorrow in her womb for 20 years." It was like watching bones assemble under faint light. Years later, in a different hospital not far from the Mississippi, a radiologist slid a film onto the light box and went still. In the abdomen of a black woman in her 70s glowed a small, dense outline curled near the spine, ringed in calcium. The case report that followed read almost like Whitman's, minus the overt condescension. When the historian heard about it at a conference, he drove down to see the chart himself. The attending physician allowed him to meet the family. They crowded a small consultation room, nieces, a nephew, a granddaughter, all with the same wary eyes he'd seen in so many photographs. "We always had stories about our people, and carried babies," one of the nieces said. "Great-Granny told us her grandmama was supposed to have a child by the master's boy, and they said she never did let it be born right. Kept it so they couldn't auction it. Folks used to tease, say we got stone children in this bloodline." "What was her name?" he asked gently. "Rachel, they think. Rachel something. Mize, Mayfield. We don't rightly know. Papers got lost." He wrote the variations in his notebook. On another page, underlined twice, sat the old entry. R. Mayfield, Cypress Bend. Back in his office, he laid everything out. Photocopies of Whitman's article, a poor reproduction of the museum catalog, the WPA transcript, the church note, the modern case report. One physician might speak of a calcified fetus. The women on porches called it a stone child. Each set of words carried its own verdict. He started drafting an essay, not just about pathology, but about what it meant for a society to look at a black woman who carried the consequences of rape and sale in her abdomen and see only an interesting specimen. He was midway through a paragraph when his email chimed. The message was from a curator at a small county museum near the Arkansas River. They had been cleaning out a storage room, she wrote, and found an old jar in a wooden crate labeled only medical. The liquid inside had turned the color of weak tea. Through the haze, she could make out a small, compact form, edges blunted by time. The label was nearly illegible, but she thought she could read ARC, and under that, what? Might be 187. "Could this be related to the case you mentioned on the phone?" she asked. "If you're ever in the area, you might want to see it before we decide what to do." He stared at the screen for a long time. On the desk beside him lay the photocopied death register. Across the bottom of the page, the lamp threw his own shadow. For just an instant, it seemed too heavy for his frame, as if something older leaned against it. He blinked, and the shape settled back into place. We do not know, even now, whose remains wait in that murky glass. We do know that for one woman on a plantation by the Mississippi, refusing to give up her child meant carrying the weight of an entire system inside her for 20 years. The doctors named it lithopedion. Her people called it something else and told the story in low voices so it would not vanish. Somewhere, in a basement or a body or a box of papers, there are other hard little histories the country has never brought to light. Until they are named and laid to rest, it will keep walking with that extra weight, like a nation that has learned to move around, a sorrow it has never quite dared to deliver.